welcome to the very first episode of Flying Sloppy. That's a little bit of humor for you guys to emphasize that regardless of our hours or experience, we can all improve our cockpit performance. I'm David Miller, Director of Safety Education and Programs for CJP Safety Foundation. And joining me today are Safety Consultant Neil Singer and Astronaut Charlie Precourt, Chairman of our CJP Safety Committee. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, David.
Hey, Charlie. Charlie, you like my background?
I do. You look like the Mr. Wizard or something in space.
Well, I did this for two reasons, Charlie. Number one, I think it's the closest I'll ever get to space. And number two, if I showed you where I actually live, you would see that I do live in a van down by the river.
I'm just glad you didn't introduce me as your subordinate, because you're not my boss.
That's an inside joke. I think only our members understand that one. So, guys, we're here today to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, and we know that thousands of pilots and airplanes have been grounded for quite a while, and we've already, CJP and Textron have addressed the process on how we make our airplanes ready for flight again, but what about the pilot? We haven't really talked about that, and what do we do as pilots who have not, what do we need to do to jump right back in the cockpit in some challenging situations when we've been on an extended layoff? After my first month out and not flying, I went to the hangar and I ran the engines just to, to cycle everything in the systems. And I was hoping that the pandemic would only be 30 days, and soon the weeks went by to months. And I realized that I needed to exercise my flying skills too. And after about 6 weeks, I went out to the airport, and it was a beautiful day. It was, I took a picture. Matter of fact, we'll show the picture. It was completely deserted. But I realized when I started flying that it was not just like riding a bicycle. My skills had atrophied. I missed even setting the altimeter before departure. I found that I needed to really rely on the checklist. I was behind the airplane basically, and that was after 6 weeks. So I know it's affected everybody, and I know, Charlie, you've had some specific experience with getting back in the saddle. So you want to give us a couple of comments about that?
Sure. Thanks, David. I've experienced this like you did here recently with COVID, but I remember the first time in my flying career that happened to me was back many, many years ago. I was flying 238s for the Air Force, and I'd been on a special assignment. I think it was probably 6 weeks, like you just mentioned. Came back, and because I had gotten to such a level of proficiency and comfort, flying 3 times a day, a lot of muscle memory, a lot of routine, a lot of, things that happen automatic that you don't even recognize, that I had lost during that 6 weeks. And I didn't know that I'd lost it till I actually confronted it in flight, pulling up on the downwind. We calculate our speeds for approach, and I missed that step. And there I am on final lower in the gear and looking at my airspeed indicator going, whoops, I guess I didn't calculate my final approach speed. So I'm scrambling, right? And didn't know I'd forgotten it till I'd actually confronted it in flight. And so I went out here recently and decided, same situation as you, let's do something, exercise myself in the airplane, because I know this is going to happen to me. And I elected to fly basically a Checkride Profile here locally. We'll show you some of that. And sure enough, I had forgotten a whole bunch of stuff. So I did it 2 or 3 times to build my proficiency back. And so I think it's really valuable, and we'll share some more of those details.
Neil, you want to talk about some of the things that you've seen? You mentor, obviously, and you do check rides, and some of the things you've seen both with COVID and just in general when you're working with a pilot who has not been flying for some extended period of time. What do they miss? What are the issues?
Just to try to group things into a few big areas I see. Certainly one of the first ones that I don't think would be surprising for anybody is profile recall. Tends to go out the window pretty quickly, especially any of the profiles that are not things we're doing in normal flying, that are hard to recall, have a lot of steps. So what I call the big 3, engine failure after V1, a 2-engine go around, single engine go around. Murphy's Law says that, of course, if we're going to have an engine failure, it's going to be after we haven't been in the airplane for 3 months, right? So it would be kind of critical to review those, because even someone who is flying more consistently isn't going and doing V1 cuts typically, right, or go arounds. And so I do see that even multi-thousand hour in type pilots, when it's been a while since their last recurrent, will mix up the order, forget the gear on a V1 cut because they're so focused on the rudder and the speed that they're at 800 feet above the field with the gear still hanging down, wondering why the plane's barely climbing. So you see those type of errors quite a bit. I would also include in that memory items. Again, you know, Murphy's Law says that if we're going to have to do an emergency evacuation, it's going to be the longest time since we've looked at the emergency evacuation set of memory items, right? So I would certainly recommend, if someone has taken a long time off from flying, well, I'll talk about this in another bullet point as well, but I think a great idea is to go to the airplane the day before you're going to fly and just spend some time in the cockpit. Whether you run up the plane as David did, or whether you just sit in the cockpit in the hangar or on the ramp, you can go through those memory items and those profiles, touch the relevant control. You certainly wouldn't want to be moving gear handles, etc., but you can just touch the control to prod the muscle memory and go through all of the check ride maneuver profiles, go through all of the memory items a couple times. And I think you will find that after a few repetitions, it does feel significantly more easy and easy to recall. The second sort of broad category I see, if you haven't flown for a while, is flow state. People use that term flow state when you're working and it's effortless and everything's just happening right, and it feels natural, right? Well, that seems to go out the window pretty quickly. When I fly it with people who haven't flown for some time, everything feels more jerky, more start and stop and pause. And, you know, I'll tell you a little funny story. Just yesterday, I had to drive to the store to pick up some food, and I haven't been driving much over the last few months. I imagine most of us haven't been. So I might go a week without driving my car. And my car has a couple little buttons on the steering wheel, and they're not labeled. And one of the buttons starts and stops music, and one of the buttons will initiate a phone call. Well, twice I called the last person I talked to because I was trying to pause music. And something that I wouldn't even think about when I'm driving my car all the time, I kept hitting the wrong button and twice called this poor person inadvertently because I'm just out of that flow state, right, of just not having to think about what button I'm hitting. And I see the same thing, frankly, happen in airplanes. You know, where's that switch? You know, I'll see something where a switch you exercise every single flight, all of a sudden in the middle of a flight, a pilot will just not be able to remember where for the life of them that switch is, and they have to look through every switch. And in something like a CJ3, that can take a while to go through all the switches in the cockpit and find the one you're looking for. So, you know, my advice on that is, again, go to the plane a day early, run through your normal checklist in this case, you know, not your profiles, not your abnormals, memory items, just run through your normal checklist from startup to start shutdown without doing anything. It's going to push you through all the steps. It's going to push you through finding those switches you'll be using in flight. And then the other piece I would say there is give yourself extra time to complete your flight when you do your flight. Don't set up a flight with any time pressure, so that you can take all of your steps more slowly and more deliberately than might feel normal. Really force yourself to slow down, because just be aware that it's going to take you longer. And if you're rushing, you're just going to really increase your chance of making an error. And then I guess the third sort of big topic or area I would talk about is situational awareness. Really seems to suffer after somebody hasn't been flying for a while. And I would say, you know, some of the biggest examples of situational awareness suffering, automation status, pilots thinking the autopilot's doing one thing, it's doing something else, not engaging a mode they need to engage. So, you know, the solution for that is really incorporate your scoreboard into your scan, use the CAMI methodology, confirming the mode you want, you're activating it, you're monitoring via the scoreboard, you got what you want, and then taking intervention if necessary. Really, again, force yourself to be a little bit more deliberate. What might happen really quickly and automatically when you've been flying for a while, don't try to make it feel that quick and automatic. You know, make it a more deliberate process. Aircraft energy state is another one. When people haven't flown for a while, their speed's all over the place. They're too fast, they're too slow. It's a lot harder to really hit your speed. One thing I think helps there is have a target speed in mind. You know, so the approach environment, you're at 3,000 feet, you're getting vectored on the downwind for an approach. You could really be anywhere in our airplanes from 130 to 200 and be legal and be safe, right? But there's probably a better speed than just anywhere between 130 and 200. So you should have a speed in mind for every phase of your flight. And what that's going to do is that's just going to help you tighten up your speed control. If I don't have a speed in mind, then anything between 130 and 200 might look good. If I say, you know, I'm getting vectored down when I should be at 170 with the approach flaps out, then I'm probably going to keep my speed in a much tighter range if I've set myself a target. So use the speed bug. We can set VT as a target speed. So use the speed bug if you need to, but at a minimum, try to have a target speed in mind. And then the third situational awareness that I see go out the window when pilots haven't flown for a while is just general IFR situational awareness on a procedure. You know, what's happening? How close to localizer intercept am I? Am I above the glide slope, below the glide slope? Again, these are all the things that feel intuitive when we're flying every week or several times a week. But I find it for myself. If I haven't flown, I frequently go 2-3 weeks without flying. And if I haven't flown for 2 or 3 weeks and I have to go fly an approach, I know I'm going to be working a lot harder if I'm hand flying an approach to keep that localizer centered. Just everything feels a little more sluggish and not as natural. So my advice there is, again, don't have any time pressure. You know, you want to really up your personal minimums, and we'll talk about in a second. I have a slide with our CJP SOP recommendations on if you're not very current, some of the things we think about. And slow down. Okay. So recognize on an instrument approach, you're going to need more time to scan. You're going to need more time to get the big picture state of mind. And this is not the time to be doing your first approach you've flown in 2 months, 3 months, in IMC at night in the mountains, right? That's not the way you get back in instrument currency. So we'll talk again about the CJP SOPs. But what I would certainly recommend is you think about going beyond that, because, you know, with our recommendations, we speak in fairly broad terms. So some of the specific CJP SOPs we recommend, if you have not flown 15 hours as PIC in the last 90 days, we recommend increasing your fuel reserves up to an hour, a minimum. We recommend that you increase your minimum visibility for takeoff to 1 mile. So there might be situations where if we're training in the simulator, we're taking off in as little as 500 RVR. But we recommend, you know, if you haven't flown much recently, that you not take off with less than 1 mile visibility. We recommend increasing your approach minimums by 1/2 mile and 200 feet to the DA or MDA. We want you to think about maybe not conducting any instrument approaches in IMC or night that's not with vertical guidance. So fortunately, most of our approaches now have vertical guidance, but you certainly wouldn't want to be doing a non-precision approach at night as your first approach in 60 days or so. We have some recommendations about a VASI or PAPI to the landing runway in there, especially at an unfamiliar field. We wouldn't want to go into an unfamiliar airport after a long break and not have a VASI or PAPI. We recommend you stay away from circling approaches while you're getting recurrent again. And now certainly practicing a circling approach in VMC is one thing, but actually having to fly a circling approach. And we recommend you're a little more conservative with your landing performance factoring. So most of the time we say an 80% safety factor is appropriate. If you haven't been flying much, we would recommend you increase that up to 60% safety factor. So again, you're recognizing that you've gotten rusty. Your performance on VREF is probably not going to be the best. Your adherence to the instrument procedure might not be right on center line. And again, as I said, these are just some floors to think about. So, you know, according to our SOPs, you could still go fly if it was 1 mile and 400 overcast and go shoot an ILS approach. You know, for somebody who has taken 30 days off, that might be okay. For somebody who's taken 3 months off, even that might be a little bit lower. And you might want to say, you know, I'm going to wait for really a VMC day and do my first flight entirely in VMC and just go shoot some vectored ILSs and 2-engine go-arounds before I actually leave my local area. So some things to think about there.
So that's great information, Neil. A couple of things that I just thought about when you're talking. One is you talk about getting in the cockpit and going through the physical maneuvers without manipulating the airplane. What I've done, and I think other members have done, is exactly that. Power up the airplane, and I take my iPad out to the hangar and I watch the Ready for Recurrent videos, the What Good Looks Like video, which we have for each individual airplane. And I can actually go through the scenarios that you're talking about and watch you do it on the iPad while I'm actually sitting in the cockpit, to even make it more relevant. And to your comment about driving and getting back in the saddle in terms of driving, I've got a friend, Greg, who just took delivery of an SUV, and the vehicle came equipped with an iPad or an iPhone app that actually monitors and scores his driving, how hard he brakes, his turning G's, all that's recorded in the car. And Charlie, that goes to what you and Neil have been working on for a long time, this FOQA issue, and how, first of all, I want you to talk about, if you would, what is FOQA? Do we need it? How can we use it? And how have you used it in your scenarios, getting back to flying again, to show any kind of challenges that you need to work on in your flying?
You bet. Thanks. And first off, I'd just thank Neil again for his summary there. He could have been debriefing the flights that I'm going to show you here in just a bit that I used in the local area to get back to some proficiency. All those points are spot on, and I experienced all of them as I was building my currency back. So I'll go into a little bit of that. But FOQA, as you raised the issue there, Flight Operations Quality Assurance. It's a system that's been in use by the airlines for some time now that uses flight data monitoring, taking parameters off the airplane, aggregating all that data flight to flight so that their safety management system can identify areas where there may be issues in their operations, whether it's rusty pilot proficiency on a certain area, failure to follow an SOP, or even some things like at specific airports where air traffic control has gotten into a bad habit of doing a vector to final that's too short. You get crammed into the final approach fix. And you start to see these trends, and then we can raise them for change and for correction before they lead to an accident. So we've looked at our most preponderant accidents are things like runway overruns. 50% of our total accidents and incidents and citations are in runway overruns. And we see a real benefit if we can capture data in a similar manner to help us find those things that are leading up to the causes of those overruns. So we've had a beta test in progress with many of our members. About a dozen of our members are contributing data in real time. I'll show you how my airplane's equipped to do that. We're analyzing how we might develop a similar situation. But just, as a way of tie out here, I used it in the local flying I did to regain my proficiency practicing these 6158 profiles. And so we'll show you some of that here in a second. I'll just piggyback on what Neil said about first the loss of profile proficiency, the go-arounds, and the muscle memory that comes with that. I did some of that and noticed right off the bat that I was doing things like reaching for the Felch button and hitting the back course button on the autopilot. There was an automatic move that became unautomatic, and I had to relearn it. The idea of speed on the downwind, you'll see on these profiles, we show you some pictures here in a second. I did just that. What I really would like to try to achieve is 160 knots for me in the 1+ on a radar downwind being vectored to final. And as I get on the dog leg to final, when he says cleared for the approach, hit the approach mode and put my approach flaps down and have my 160 is about 60% N1. And if I do it just right, I can set 55% N1 as I turn final and never touch the throttles until I get down to about VREF plus 10. And it's because of the timing of when I put the gear down and the next notch of flaps and start my descent. And so all of that gets you to where you're able to maintain that speed you're targeting without a lot of effort instead of chasing it. The first time I went out and did a proficiency flight, I was all over the sky, like Neil said, and chasing my speed till I slowed down and went back to set things where they need to be and get into the routine again. And it took quite a bit of effort to recall those things that had become automatic. So what you learn out of this is kind of surprising. If you think about the kind of flying a lot of us do, which is point to point, cross country for a business trip. Maybe a lot of times you're doing a visual approach full stop because it's a nice day and you want to minimize your time in the air and it's less costly, more time efficient to do so. You could fly 1,000 hours and find yourself only doing really 30 to 40 hours of real, what Neil calls profile time, where you're working these kinds of profiles. And until you go back to the simulator to do it on a check ride, you're probably not doing it very often. I found that I went out and I did 3 of these in the last month. And you can see the Ogden Airport there in the lower right. And this is a trace of the flight. And this is me on COVID, by the way. Lynn says you must have made yourself dizzy when she looks at this on FlightAware. But anyway, I take off, I go out and I do a single engine practice ILS to a single engine mist, which is where the airport, it shows the airplane turn and final for that. And then in the mist, it goes out there to the west to the mist approach holding. And then before I did the second approach, I went up to the north and I did some steep turns, some stalls, some practice entering into my designated holding pattern fix with directions. And then I came back down to the south and turned in on an LPV. And then I went back out to the northwest to intercept the VOR Alpha arc for a circle. And you can see the pink circle there down by the Ogden Airport. So this is a check ride profile that exercised all those things that we don't do very often. And I found it quite interesting. And I really recommend this. We're going to actually include something like this as part of the extra credit block for the gold standard. You go out and fly a profile like this and you share the accomplishment of that, and we'll log it as part of a credit to the gold standard.
So Charlie, how did you capture that data? Is that the next slide?
Yeah, hold on one second. That is on the next slide. And what I would say is just a few things to think about before you go fly a profile like this. I recommend a safety observer in the right seat just to help you watch for traffic. You can do it yourself, and I've done it myself, but I pick a time of day when the traffic's really low, like on a Sunday morning. The other thing is you pick a time of day when the weather is calm. You're trying to train yourself to your own standard, what I'd call nominal kind of flight conditions, where you're not also dealing with a lot of traffic and a lot of turbulence and a lot of weather. You're trying to work on you and your proficiency. So pick a day when the traffic's low, the weather's not an issue, turbulence is not an issue. Go out there and work towards these things. And what I did was I first went to Neil's Ready for Recurrent video. I looked at the things he did. And I noticed, for instance, this is not something I did in flight, but when he does a single engine V1 cut with a continue, as he raises the gear, he also goes for the Felch and V2 setting, so that when he does take the time, when he gets to the point he's going to put it on autopilot, he's already set up for climbing in V2. Good habit patterns. Last thing you think about unless you train to that kind of thing on a regular basis. So I went through the Ready for Recurrent video. I built my own profile here. I then went out and flew it. I could normally debrief myself, but this methodology, using the data capture that I'm going to show you here, allowed the system to automatically debrief me right away as soon as I had parked the airplane. This method of training yourself for proficiency will make you ready for recurrent. You will go to the simulator and feel really, really ready. And so we really highly recommend this, and it was just a matter of COVID exposing us to a place where we could recommend some things that would help every one of us. So yeah, go ahead, David, to the next chart.
So Charlie, what are we seeing here? And this is, I guess, how you capture the data, right?
Yeah, so this is just coincidentally part of our beta test for our potential focus system for our CJP community and our members. So we have been testing through lots of different options with different OEMs, and this particular setup uses what's called an AirSync box. It's a Wi-Fi and cellular interface that you can see is plugged into the USB port of my backup FMS. I happen to have an Avidyne. If you had a GTN 750, a similar kind of thing. The Garmin and Avidyne backup FMSs, or even the primary Garmin G1000 and 3000, will talk to this box. It's a very inexpensive box. I think the outlay is about $900 for the box, and then there's cellular subscription that's pretty darn cheap, frankly. And so what it does is it records the flight log onto the box while you're flying. And then as soon as you land, it transmits that log, in this case, to a data analysis service. In this case, I use CloudAhoy. And what happens is automatically, I didn't do anything except turn on the airplane and then shut down and go to my app. When you open the app for AirSync, you get the picture that shows where the airplane is, and that's in the location tab. If I click over to the flights tab in the middle view, you can see all the flights I've made. I click on the last one that I'm showing you here, that practice profiles, Checkride, 28th of June. When I click on that, it takes me to a page that allows me to hit debrief in CloudAhoy. When I do that, it takes me to a CloudAhoy interface, and it shows me the flight just like I did on the big screen, only it's on my phone. And so in there lies all of the data automatically and instantly fed back to me, so I can see how I did on my flight. So if you go to the next screen, we got a couple of the segments of the flight that I showed you. The first one is just our dreaded steep turns from our Checkride. So you can see where in the upper left part of the image there, on the far left, you can see the airplane. I'm entering the turn, a right turn, steep turn, and then my score automatically spit back to me. I got a 93 on this, and it measures all the things we look at: altitude, indicated speed, bank angle, and so forth, and the heading that I roll out on, and it has my actual entry conditions, the goal that I was trying to hit, the actual performance I hit, and then it plots it. Now, all I'm really interested in is where I made some errors. You can see my altitude wavered up and then back and up and then back, plus minus 40, 50 feet. Airspeed was a few knots of oscillation, and the bank angle a few degrees of oscillation. So it's instantaneous, quick feedback. Same thing if you go to the next one, David. This is the aircraft's at the final approach fix for the approach into runway 3 at Ogden. At the final approach fix, you can see it scores on all of our SOP performance criteria for a stabilized approach, and it'll spit back the numbers on how I did within the ranges that I flew. And then I can instantly see where to focus if I make an error. So for instance, on the next one, on a different approach, a subsequent approach, I was hand flying one, and I didn't even see this when it happened, but I was flying the command bars and overshot the final slightly, and you can see I got downgraded for it. It focuses with a yellow. It would be green, yellow, red, and it focuses where I made an error. And frankly, I was doing some other things and didn't see that I overshot, not by a significant amount, well less than a degree of overshoot, but enough that this pointed out, hey, I must have been distracted coming into the final vector onto course. And next time I am in the midst of making that final interceptor roll out, I'll spend a little more, I'll just know that this happened to me last time. I'll spend a little more time watching that rollout on course. So some really good and instantaneous, no pilot necessary to do a lot of work to get this data. And so we feel like we're able to use it to help us with things like building proficiency, self-scoring, and evaluating our proficiency on some of these profiles. And one day we hope to make this a focus system that can really help us with things like our insurance premiums. So happy to talk a little more about that too, David.
Yeah, I know, Charlie, that the insurance issue is a huge deal. We're seeing premium increases of 2 and 3 times what we experienced before. And I think the effort on behalf of the Safety Committee and CJP as a whole is to differentiate our members as a risk pool,
right,
for the underwriters, so that we are trying to do things more safely, trying to incorporate SOPs, trying to do all the things that you and Neil have been preaching for a number of years to make us not only safer pilots, but to reduce our costs of operation, especially on the insurance side. Great ideas, guys. Before we sign off, Neil, any comments you'd like to make?
I would just reiterate what I said, which is expect that things are going to feel rusty. You don't want to go into your first flight in challenging conditions on a must-do mission. So make your first flight, set yourself up for success, take all the time in the world, get out to the plane early. Better yet, go the day before and spend some time in the plane, and just give yourself extra time and no pressure.
Yeah, I would second that. And just from the experience of flying these profiles in the airplane, one of the other things I'd emphasize is we in CJP are trying to remind everybody of the balance between in aircraft and in simulator training. And so I, in my own mind, reinforced the value of that by going out and flying these profiles, and how frustrating it was the first time I did it, grabbing the back course button instead of the Felch button, not ending up with the right nav, messing up a holding entry, and then going and redoing them again until I felt really comfortable. You can't imagine how nice it felt. Like Neil said, getting the airspeed to where it's easy to control on a vector downwind to final, where I could set 60% N1, be nailing 160 all the way down the downwind, get turned on the dog leg to final, lower half my approach flaps. As the glide path came to half dot low, go ahead and lower the gear, lower the land flaps, and without touching the power, but maybe backing it off 5%, I'm right on VREF plus 10 coming through 1,000 feet. No effort. It's just amazing how you flail until you get back into that groove. So Neil nailed it, and he could have been debriefing my flight without seeing it.
That's super, guys. This has been fun. We should do this again. I think we have a list of things to talk about and lots of time to do it, I guess. So we hope you've enjoyed this broadcast today. Look forward to some more. If you have any comments or suggestions for ideas, just contact us through the instructors forum at the CJP Safety website, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, guys.
CJP Safety and Education Foundation is committed to providing all pilots with the best tools to safely operate their airplane. Our content is always free of charge, and you can access it by clicking on the Safety tab on our website. Until next time, fly safe.